welcome to Encouraging Others and Loving Jesus. I'm your host, Kim Smith. This is episode 316. Oh, the story they could tell. Do you have people in your life that are really good storytellers? Or by chance, are you one of those storytellers where when you get to rolling and telling stories, whether they are funny or they're serious, but like you draw people in by the way that you tell the story? I'm not one of those, but I do have people in my life who are. One in particular is just excellent at telling funny stories about family issues primarily. It's one of my favorite things to hear ever in the history. And so today we're going to talk about a story that each of the people that were involved could tell. Now, I'm going to tell you that I am so incredibly thankful to God that He had me go at a snail's pace through the miracles of the prophet Elisha. I mentioned a week or so ago that I was very tempted to take these kind of as a set of the miracles of Elisha. And I have a feeling that a lot of people have done that over the years, because with one so quirky, because today's story is just really quirky. For one story to be so quirky, what I've seen as I have done my research and listened to a handful of short devotionals — I didn't listen to a long sermon on it, but listening to short devotionals, I think that many people have not known what to do with this story in particular. It is contained in 2 Kings 4:38 through 41. So last week we talked about a major miracle in the history of Elisha. And, well, not just one miracle, but multiple miracles when it came to the woman from Shunem and her faithfulness to taking care of Elisha as he traveled on his prophetic journeys, and how that Elisha wanted to bless her and pray that she would have a son. And she had the son, and the son died, and God, through Elisha, saw the son restored to health. Like, it's one that is a story to tell, no doubt about it. But today's is just 38 through 41, and it's odd as can be. In the NLT, you don't see the phrase that a lot of people have used to name their sermon or sermonette about this particular story. A lot of people call this story Death in a Pot, because in translations like the ESV and others, that's what you see. Oh, man of God, there is death in the pot. The NLT, which I use for this podcast primarily, is more straightforward about what really is there. Man of God, there's poison in this stew. Like, they just spoke it in normal, regular language, and you don't have to wonder, because that was really what was going on. There was something poisonous put into the stew, and this was, or could have been, disastrous for this group of prophets. And what my concern is, very much my concern is that I have seen multiple people talking about this particular text, and I believe they're pulling something out of it that was not intended. And I understand that with a text like this, it's hard to figure out just what was, number one, what was God doing through this? And number two, why in the world would He include this short story in Scripture? What in the world are we to learn from the death in the pot story? But I think the key to this, and it's one of the many lessons that I've learned by doing this podcast, is sometimes you just need to sit with the Lord and with a particular text, and just trust that God is going to show you, not all the reasons, but at least one reason. I've told you it's my handle for the week as to why in the world this story might be included. And I am just so grateful because, again, we can take all of these incredible miracles of Elisha and we can talk about them all in one day and just be grateful that God worked through this man to accomplish these great and mighty miracles for all of the people to see and for them to share with others. But I bring us back to the point that I made a couple of weeks ago. These were done for individuals. There were people in need, and God saw their need and gave Elisha the power to bring about a positive end to this story. So if we as outsiders look at this, we may very well gloss over these miracles. Whereas if we were the ones sitting there in the midst of a famine and we have poisonous stew and that's the only thing for supper, it takes on a different light. One of the things that I've taught on multiple times on this podcast is if you haven't walked in someone's shoes, sometimes we have a habit of missing some of the nuances. In this case, I don't think we're missing the nuances by just looking at the story of face value, but I think that we lose sight of how huge this would have been for this group of prophets in that particular day and time, and how the story would have spread. You won't believe what Elisha did. Now, hopefully they knew that it was God working through Elisha, but Elisha was the point person. And the other thing that I've seen, I saw one yesterday, a person who took this little bitty set of scripture and they pulled out they spent a lot of time on where it was located. It was in Gilgal. And they must have done like a page or two on the importance of Gilgal. And I'm all about understanding the setting. But I don't think that applies in this particular case. I think people have just tried to massage this story into something that it's not. It's an incredible, miraculous story that changed the lives forever of a group of prophets. So let's read it. While we're at it, let's read it. So 2 Kings 4:38 through 41. Elisha now returned to Gilgal. There was a famine in the land. So Elisha, first and foremost, Elisha has been traveling. He's been doing what the Lord has laid on him to do. And he and his servant Gehazi have been making their rounds. And that servant, he's not named in today's text, but more than likely that's who they're talking about, because that he is named in other places. And one of these days we're going to get to the not so good Gehazi story, but today that is not that day. And he says he returned to Gilgal. So obviously Gilgal was a place where Elisha had spent some time, which if we go back in the text, we're going to see that in the scriptures around it. It says, and there was a famine in the land. So most of us who are listening in on this podcast today have never experienced a famine. Like a real, true famine where around us is nothing. There's nothing growing because there's no rain, or like everything is dried up. I remember seeing a video maybe last year from a part of Africa. And in that part of Africa, there was an area where the river had dried up. and all of the creatures that were there that couldn't possibly, they didn't have enough strength to go anywhere else to get water and get sustenance. They just died right there. It was just the valley of dry bones, so to speak. And it was all because the water had dried up. We, as most people who are on here are Americans, we don't know what that's like. Like, we've just never experienced that type of famine. But you more than likely have experienced a time in your life where you didn't have all that you thought you needed. I've never experienced a famine, but I remember a few years ago when I didn't know what I was going to eat. And I remember that anxiety. So I want you to go back, whether it was a physical need of food or it was a deep spiritual famine or maybe an emotional famine. When was a time that you just felt in great need and you didn't have any resources yourself to take care of that problem? That's where this group of prophets were on this day. One day, as the group of prophets was seated before him, being Elisha, he said to his servant, "Put a large pot on this fire and make some stew for the rest of the group." One of the young men went out into the field to gather herbs and came back with a pocket full of wild gourds. He shredded them and put them into the pot without realizing they were poisonous. Some of the stew was served to the men, but after they had eaten a bite or two, they cried out, "Man of God, there's poison in the stew." So they would not eat it. Elisha said, "Bring me some flour." Then he threw it into the pot and said, "Now it's all right. Go ahead and eat." And then it did not harm them. So again, I have seen speakers and or preachers who have, to say that they massage this text is an understatement. Like, they've gone into why the flour was important. It's a story about Elisha and a group of prophets and some poisonous stew. Like, we don't need to try to take this grand spiritual lesson out of this. It was not intended that way. People do that with the teachings of Jesus or the miracles of Jesus, or like some of them do have symbolism, like, and it's very obvious, but like, just put yourself in the setting. There's a group of prophets and they're in a desperate situation and they are trusting in this stew to get them through another day, and it's not edible. What do you do? In their case, they cry out to Elisha because Elisha represents God. And they know that Elisha seems to know how to get things done. And Elisha tosses in some flour and all is well with the stew. Don't try to take every element out of the story and make a spiritual lesson. Take the spiritual lesson as it is. These people were in need, and God provided for their need in a miraculous way through his servant. And from that day forward, you can bet this group of prophets had a story to tell of God's miraculous provision. That's the text. And that's the lesson. My question is, what story can you tell of God's goodness to you? When were you like the group of prophets in a desperate situation? Again, whether it was, I don't know how I'm going to pay my bills, or I'm in a relationship disaster and there's no way that this is going to work out. And yet, God did what only God can do. What's your story? What story can you tell of God's goodness to you? And who around you needs to hear it? There's somebody in my circle who this is a major point for them right now, because they're looking at their life and they know that the majority of it is behind them. And they realized that there are a lot of younger people who don't know the stories of God's goodness to them. And so they're being very intentional about telling those stories. And that's what I encourage all of us to do. Whether it's to the younger generation, the older generation, the neighbor, tell the stories of God's goodness. Take out a block of scripture, so to speak. Take out a section of your story and tell of the miracles of God. Whether they were like this, where it was a short moment in time, but you panicked and God provided right then, or whether it was something you prayed for 15 years and God finally did it. Share the stories of God's goodness and trust that God will use them to accomplish His great and mighty purposes. Because not only do we have the miracle in the story, we have the miracle of the story. The miracle that can happen as we share of what God has done and watch what He still wants to do through our sharing and in the lives with those of whom we share. Grab your story. Think about where you've seen God work in your life and start sharing it with your children, your grandchildren, the neighbors, your friends. Let them know that you serve a miracle working God. And guess what? If they're struggling in their faith, not believing that God could ever possibly come through for them, they might very well be encouraged that if God would do it for you, He can do it for them. If you can't tell, this story has really touched my heart. And not because it was in Gilgal, and not because we can have a cool title of Death in the Pot that I chose not to use, you can see, but that God used Elisha to bring about the supplying of the needs of these prophets in a miraculous way. And they had a story to tell that pointed to God. What's your story? And who are you going to tell? Thank you so much for tuning in. We've got one more short passage about the miracles of Elisha coming up next week. It's one that a lot of times is combined with this one, and I understand why people will do that, because they both are about sustenance. But I have a different direction I really want to go with that. I want to connect it with a New Testament story that looks very similar, done by Jesus. So that's just a hint for where we're going next week. Just thank you for tuning in. Thank you for sharing this podcast with others. At this point in life, I'm still working full time. So I'm not trying to use a marketing budget and get this podcast out in front of the masses. It's just not where I am. I'm in a whole lot better place than when I started this podcast all those years ago, where I didn't have the money to pay to record the podcast. I'm past that point, but it is still an all on my dime proposition, or all on God's dime, because He's just allowing me to steward that money. But I'm just trusting that God's going to get this podcast in the ears of those who need to hear. And you are a part of that opportunity. So thank you so very much. It's free for you to listen to, free for you to share. You can go to the very bottom and click on the QR code. And it'll take you to all 316 episodes. And they are as varied as my days have been. But I thank God for each week when He has showed up and showed out. So, ask the Lord to show you the stories of your life, the stories of His faithfulness, and that He gives you the courage to share those stories with those around you. Share of God's goodness and trust Him to accomplish great and mighty miracles through your obedience. And just remember, it's always a trust and obey kind of day.